By daybreak in 1928, at a grist-mill dam along the Harpeth River in Middle Tennessee, the night watchman's dog came back without the man. The Bulldog was called Nub, a brindled thing with a chest like a barrel and a jaw you could trust to hold. He kept the nightmen company when they worked the spillway boards or checked the sluice gates after the last shift went home. Nub slept by the iron wheel housing and walked the low path between the dam and the mill house without being told. He was steady in the way a good dog is steady, the kind that does not bark at shadows or chase after nothing. And the man who fed him every night at 9:10 had been steady too, the kind men in Tennessee learn to rely on, especially in work that puts you alone in the dark with rushing water and old machinery that can take a hand or a life if you turn your back at the wrong moment. The man's name was Horace Lyle. He was 41 years old, thick in the shoulders, quiet in his work, the sort who checked a bolt twice and never rushed a job just because the shift was nearly done. He lived a quarter-mile downriver in a shotgun house with a wife who kept chickens and a daughter 10 years old who was learning to read out of a primer her mother had carried from Virginia. Horace walked to the dam 6 nights a week carrying a tin lunch pail with a wire handle, the kind that rattled a little when he walked. He always arrived before full dark. He always left after dawn. The mill ground corn and some wheat when they could get it, and Horace's job was to watch the water level, grease the wheel shaft twice a night, and keep the spillway clear of branches that came down the Harpeth during storms. He never missed a shift. He never left early. Men around that river still say he was the kind you could trust to work alone. And that made what happened harder to carry. Harder to explain to his wife when she came to the mill yard that first morning asking where he was. On the night it began, the dam was running low. There had been no rain for 11 days, and the mill pond sat flat and dark under a mist that never moved, just hung there above the water like something breathing slow. The air smelled of wet stone and rust from the wheel housing. Horace had gone down to inspect the lower boards on the spillway just after midnight. The dam had been losing pressure for 2 days, and the foreman had told him to check for leaks or debris caught against the gates. The older hands at the mill, the ones who worked the day shifts and had been there since before the war, said you could hear Horace walking on the catwalk that night. Boots on wet wood, steady as a clock. Nub went with him. They heard the dog's claws on the planks too, a lighter sound, quick and even. And then they heard nothing at all. No shout. No splash. No bark. Just the low hum of water passing under the gate, same as always. By noon the next day, Nub came back. He crawled up the slope from the lower path with his belly scraped raw, fur gone in patches, skin showing pink and wet underneath. His head hung low to the ground. His eyes showed white all the way around, the way a dog's eyes look when it has been beaten or seen something it cannot forget. His ears bled at the edges, not torn, just bleeding in thin lines along the tips, as if something had pressed too close or made a sound too loud and too sharp for a living thing to bear. One of the daymen tried to touch him, and Nub snapped without lifting his head, then crawled under the loading platform and would not come out. He would not go near the spillway. He would not cross the shadow the sluice gate threw across the dirt yard when the sun was low. When the herd boss set down Nub's iron bowl with meat and cornmeal inside, the dog whined high in his throat and backed away, ears flat, legs stiff. He had eaten from that bowl every night for 3 years. Now he would not even look at it. Horace did not come back. The foreman, a man named Pruitt who had run the mill for 16 years and did not scare easy, walked down to check the catwalk that same afternoon. The spillway boards were dry as old bone, though the mist still hung over the mill pond thick as breath, and the air down by the water was cold enough to sting your lungs. There were no boot prints on the boards. There were no claw marks from the dog. The wood was clean, almost too clean, as if it had been wiped. But at the edge of the dam, right where the stone lip met the water, someone had left Horace's lunch pail. It sat upright, the wire handle folded down neat. Pruitt touched it with the back of his hand and pulled away fast. The pail was hot enough to sting through gloves, hot enough to leave a red mark across his knuckles. And all around it, for 10 feet in every direction, the frost lay white and thick across the spillway planks. It had settled there in the night and never melted, not even in full sun. Not even by 2 in the afternoon when the temperature had climbed past 50 degrees. Pruitt carried the pail back to the mill house, holding it with a rag. He set it on the workbench and told the daymen not to touch it. By evening it had gone cold, but no one wanted it near them. One of the older hands, a man who had known Horace since he was a boy, said they should return it to his wife. Another said she should not have to see it. In the end, they left it on the bench, and it sat there for weeks, untouched, until someone finally threw it in the river one night when no one was watching. That same night, the new watchman, a younger man, barely 25, who needed the job and could not afford to refuse it, set lanterns along the catwalk to mark the safe path. He lit 4 of them, spaced 10 feet apart, and hung them on hooks that Horace himself had driven into the posts years before. The flames burned clean at first, tall and yellow in the still air. Then, one by one, they leaned. Not toward the river, not toward the wind, because there was no wind. They leaned toward the closed floodgate as if something behind those iron plates were drawing the light inward, pulling it slow and steady toward the water. The watchman did not stay the full shift. He left before midnight and told Pruitt the next morning he would not go back. Nub's chain was found 2 days later. It lay in a tight ring by the front gate of the mill yard, coiled neat as a man would coil a rope, each link laid flat against the next in a perfect circle. The clasp was still snapped shut. The leather collar was still attached. There were no paw prints in the dust around it. No one had heard the dog bark or whine or cry. The chain had been fastened to a post thick as a man's thigh, bolted clean through with an iron spike, and Nub had never slipped it before, not once in 3 years of nights. The spike was still driven. The post was still standing. But the chain lay coiled 10 feet away in a shape no dog could make by pulling, no matter how hard it tried. By the 3rd morning, Nub was gone again. The daymen searched the low path, the spillway, the cattails along the pond edge. They walked the tree line. They called his name. They left food by the wheelhouse and at the loading dock. They found nothing. At 2 minutes past 3 on the morning of the 4th day, the mill's watchman clock punched itself. The clock was the kind you carry on rounds, a brass cylinder with a paper roll inside and a key you turn at stations mounted on posts to prove you walked your route and checked each point. The foreman found it the next morning on the bench inside the wheelhouse, right next to where the lunch pail had been. The key was still in the lock. The paper roll showed a clean mark at Station 4, stamped at 3:02 a.m. Station 4 was the post nearest the dam, the one that stood in open air on the catwalk 20 feet from any shelter. The watchman that night swore on his mother's name and on the Bible. Pruitt kept in the office that he had stayed inside the mill house after 10 o'clock, too frightened to walk the rounds, and no one blamed him. No one even asked him to explain further, because the men who had worked that river longer knew better than to press for details about things that should not be possible. The mill kept running through the day shifts. The wheel turned. The stones ground. The flour came out fine as it ever had. But after the sun dropped low enough to touch the tops of the sycamores across the pond, the foreman rang the bell and sent everyone home. He did not give a reason. He did not need to. The mill shut at dusk, and it stayed shut at dusk, and men around the Harpeth River in Tennessee still will not work that stretch of water after the light goes, and they still will not say exactly why. Not out loud, not in town, not where their sons and daughters can hear them and ask questions no one in Tennessee wants to answer. The last man to see Horace Lyle alive was a mill hand named Wade Turley, who worked the late grinding shift and left the mill house at 11:30 on the night Horace disappeared. Wade said Horace was standing by the wheel housing oiling the main shaft, same as he always did before midnight. He looked fine, Wade said later, standing in the mill yard with his cap in his hands. Said the water was running low but steady. Said he'd checked the spillway after he finished greasing, that was all. Wade walked home along the river path, and by the time he reached his porch a 1/4 mile downstream, it was 10 minutes to midnight. He did not hear a shout. He did not hear a splash. He heard nothing unusual at all, and that was the part that bothered him most. At 20 past midnight, a farmer named Oates, who lived across the pond on the high ground, said he heard a low sound coming from the direction of the dam. Not a shout, not a scream, just a sound like metal scraping stone, dragged slow and then stopping all at once. He did not think much of it at the time. Mills make noise. Wheels turn. Gates shift. But later, when they asked him to be sure of the time, He checked his memory against the clock in his kitchen and swore it had been 20 past 12, maybe 22 past, no later. By 4:30 in the morning, according to a drover bringing hogs into town along the river road, he heard a dog crying somewhere down near the water. He said it was not barking, not howling, just a high, steady whine like an animal in pain that cannot move. He did not stop to look. The road was dark and he had 12 hogs to deliver before sunrise. But he remembered it clearly enough to tell the search party 3 days later, and when they asked him where the sound had come from, he pointed toward the dam without hesitation. Horace's wife came to the mill just after dawn. Her name was Ida, and she carried their daughter on her hip because the girl would not stay home. Ida asked the day foreman if Horace had left early or stayed late. The foreman did not know. He sent 2 men down to the catwalk to check. They found the lunch pail. They found no sign of Horace. By 8 o'clock, Ida was sitting on the loading platform with the girl pressed against her chest, and someone had gone to fetch the neighbors. By 9, there were a dozen men walking the low path with sticks, poking at the cattails, checking the mud for boot prints. They found nothing. By 10, someone brought dogs, 2 hounds that belonged to a man who hunted coons in the ridges above the river. The dogs sniffed the catwalk, sniffed Horace's coat that Ida had brought from home, and then pulled hard toward the spillway. They got within 10 feet of the floodgate and stopped, both of them. One sat down and would not move. The other lay flat on the planks and whined, ears back, body shaking. The handler pulled the leads. He called their names. He knelt down and tried to coax them forward. They would not go. After 15 minutes, he gave up and took them back to the mill yard, and they did not stop shaking until they were past the wheelhouse and out of sight of the water. That was the first search. By noon, when Nub came crawling back up the slope, there were 30 men combing both banks of the river from the mill down to the bend a half-mile south. They walked shoulder to shoulder through the brush. They tied strips of white rag to fence posts and saplings to mark where they had been. By evening, the strip stretched a quarter-mile in both directions, fluttering in the wind like torn flags. They dragged hooks through the shallow water near the spillway. They checked under the catwalk. They checked the wheel housing. They checked every place a man could fall, every place a man could hide, every place a body could get caught in current or lodged against stone. They found nothing. One of the younger men, a boy not yet 20 who had only worked the mill for 2 months, said he thought he heard something while they were dragging the pond. A sound like a voice, faint and far off, coming from the direction of the closed floodgate. It sounded like someone calling from behind the gate, he said, and then he would not say any more, because the older men looked at him hard and told him to keep quiet and keep dragging. By the 3rd day, the rag strips had multiplied. There were more than 100 of them now, tied every few yards along the search grid. But on the morning of the 4th day, when the foreman walked the line to count heads and make sure no man was working alone, he found a strip tied to a post near the cattail stand that he knew had not been there the night before. It was clean and white, the cloth still crisp, and it was tied in the same knot the search party used, a simple loop, pulled tight. But no one remembered tying it, and when they checked the area around the post, the ground was wet and soft from the night dew, and there were no boot prints. That same morning, 2 men working the north bank said they smelled something strange near the spillway. Not rot, not decay, but a smell like hot metal, like a forge or a branding iron left too long in coals. There was no fire. There had been no fire. The air was cold, the sky was gray, and the smell faded after a few minutes. But both men swore they had smelled it, and neither would go back to that section of the bank without a 3rd man walking between them. On the 5th day, they brought a boat and swept the deeper water below the dam. The mill pond was not deep, 12 feet at most in the center, less than 6 near the edges, but the water was dark with silt, and you could not see the bottom even in full sun. They used poles to probe the mud. They used a grappling hook on a long rope. They pulled up branches, stones, an old wagon wheel, a rusted saw blade. They did not pull up Horace. At dusk on the 6th day, one of the men checking the catwalk said he saw a light moving near the floodgate. He was standing by the wheelhouse 50 yards away, and the light was faint and low, no bigger than a candle flame. moving slow along the base of the gate as if someone were walking there with a lantern in hand. He called out. The light went out. He walked down to the gate with another man, both of them carrying lanterns of their own, and they found nothing. No footprints, no oil spill, no wick, no match, no sign that anyone had been there at all. By the end of the first week, the older men were already teaching the younger ones how to work the dam in pairs. "You don't go down there alone anymore," one of them said, a man named Collier who had worked the Harpeth River mills for 20 years. "Not before sunrise, not after dark, not even in the middle of the day if the mist is sitting on the water. You take another man with you and you keep him in sight. And if he tells you he hears something or sees something, you don't argue. You come back up." The younger men nodded. They did not ask why. They had seen the dogs refuse to move. They had seen the rag strip appear where no man had walked. They had smelled the hot metal and cold air. They did not need to be told twice. On the 8th day, the circuit preacher came from town to pray with Ida and the girl. He stood in the mill yard and said a few words about loss and faith and the mysteries of God's will, and then he asked if anyone wanted to say anything about Horace. Wade Turley stepped forward. He said Horace had been a good man, a steady man, the kind you could count on. "I worked with him for 6 years, Wade said. "He never complained. He never left a job half done. And I swear on my life he was standing right there by the wheel housing at 11:30 and he was fine." Wade's voice broke at the end, and he stepped back into the group of men, and no one said anything after that. The search went on for 2 more days, but by then everyone knew they were not looking for Horace anymore. They were looking for a body. And when they did not find a body, they were looking for a reason to stop looking. The foreman gave it to them on the morning of the 10th day. He rang the bell, gathered the men, and told them they had done all they could do. "We've walked every foot of this river," he said. "We've dragged every inch of that pond. If Horace is here, we would have found him." No one argued. No one asked what that meant. They untied the rag strips from the posts and the saplings and gathered them in a pile by the wheelhouse, and someone said they should burn them, but no one wanted to light the fire, so they left them there in a heap, and the wind scattered them over the next few days until there was nothing left but a few threads caught on the fence wire. On the 11th night, the new watchman, the same young man who had set the lanterns and watched them lean toward the floodgate, quit before his shift even started. He told the foreman he would not go back to the dam alone, not for any amount of pay. The foreman did not try to change his mind. He hired 2 men to split the shift, and he told them both the same thing the older hands had been saying all week. "You work in pairs, you stay together, you don't go near the spillway after the sun goes down." The 2 men agreed. They kept the job for 3 weeks, and then they quit too, and the foreman stopped trying to find replacements. By the end of the 2nd week, the mill was running day shifts only. The wheel turned from sunup until the light started to fail, and then the foreman rang the bell and sent everyone home. No one argued. No one asked for the night pay they were losing. They just gathered their coats and their lunch pails and walked up the river path in groups of 3 or 4, and they did not look back at the dam. Late one evening, just before the bell rang, one of the day men was locking the grain bins when he heard it. A soft 2-note sound, low and steady, coming from somewhere near the spillway. It sounded like a whistle, the kind a man might use to call a dog or signal to another man across a distance. He stood still and listened. The sound came again. Same 2 notes, but this time it seemed to come from 2 directions at once. Once from the floodgate, and once from the far side of the pond, as if 2 men were whistling back and forth to each other in the growing dark. He did not wait to hear it a 3rd time. He left the bins unlocked and walked fast to the mill yard, and when the foreman asked him why he looked so pale, he said he had felt sick all of a sudden and needed to go home. The foreman let him go. He did not ask any more questions. That same night, after everyone had left, the mill sat quiet under a sky that had gone the color of ash. The catwalk was empty. The wheel was still. The water lapped soft against the spillway stones. And somewhere in the darkness below the floodgate something moved. Not loud, not fast, just a slow scraping sound like metal dragged across stone. The same sound the farmer had heard 2 weeks before at 20 past midnight, but this time, there was no one there to hear it. The mill was empty, the gates were locked, and the only living thing left on the property was a brindled bulldog, gone for the second time, and no one ever saw him again. 3 weeks after Horace disappeared, his lunch pail appeared again. It was sitting on the same stone lip of the dam where it had been found the first time, upright and clean, the wire handle folded down neat as if someone had just set it there and walked away. The day foreman saw it at 7 in the morning when he came to unlock the mill house. He knew it was the same pail because of the dent in the bottom rim, a half-moon shape where Horace had dropped it once against the wheel housing. The foreman had thrown that pail in the river himself 3 weeks earlier, late at night, wrapped in a burlap sack weighted with stones. He had watched it sink. He had not told anyone because he did not want Ida to know, and he did not want the men asking why he felt the need to get rid of it. Now, it was back. He walked down to the spillway alone, even though he had told every man never to go there alone, and he picked up the pail with both hands. It was cold this time, cold as river water, but when he turned it over, he saw something that made him drop it and step back fast. There was a piece of paper folded inside, wedged tight against the bottom. He pulled it out with shaking fingers. The paper was dry, the ink was clear, and the handwriting was Horace's. It said, "Check the gate." That was all. 3 words written in the same slanted script Horace used when he marked the water levels in the logbook the mill kept by the door. The foreman knew that handwriting. He had seen it 100 times. He stood there on the spillway stones with the wind pulling at his coat and the paper trembling in his hand. And he did not know what to do. Horace had been gone for 3 weeks. The search had ended. The preacher had prayed. Ida had stopped coming to the mill. And now there was a note in Horace's hand, telling him to check the gate. He brought the note back to the mill yard and showed it to Wade Turley and 2 other men who had known Horace well. Wade looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "That's his writing. I'd know it anywhere." The other men nodded. One of them, a man named Haskell, who had worked with Horace for 8 years, said, "When did he write this?" No one answered. No one wanted to say what they were all thinking, that Horace had written it after he disappeared, or that something else had written it. They checked the gate that same morning. All 4 of them, walking together down the catwalk with tools and lanterns even though the sun was bright and high. The floodgate was closed, same as it had been for weeks. The iron plates were bolted tight. The wheel mechanism that opened and closed the gate was rusted in place. They checked the bolts. They checked the hinges. They checked the stone housing where the gate sat against the spillway wall. They found nothing out of place, nothing broken, nothing moved. But while they were standing there, Wade said he smelled it again. That smell like hot metal, like a branding iron pulled from coals. Haskell smelled it too. They both turned and looked at the gate, and for just a moment, just long enough to make a man doubt what he was seeing, the surface of the iron plates seemed to shimmer, the way air shimmers above a road on a hot summer day. Then it was gone, and the plates were just cold iron again, dark and wet from the mist. They went back up and did not speak about it. The foreman put the note in the desk drawer and locked it. He told the men not to say anything to Ida or to anyone in town. "We don't know what this means," he said, "and until we do, we keep it quiet." The men agreed. But word spread anyway, the way word always spreads in a place where everyone knows everyone. By the end of the week, half the town knew about the note. By the end of the month, people were saying Horace had come back, that he was still out there somewhere near the dam, trying to tell them something. Some said he had enemies. There was a man in town, a farmer named Clyde Booth, who had argued with Horace over a boundary fence 2 years earlier. The argument had turned bitter, and Booth had threatened to settle it one way or another, though no one believed he meant real harm. But after the note appeared, people started remembering that threat. Booth heard the talk and came to the mill himself to say it was a lie. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and swore he had nothing to do with Horace's disappearance. The foreman believed him. Most of the men believed him. But the talk did not stop, because people needed something to believe that made sense. Others said the land out past the thorn fence and the stretch of scrub and marsh that ran along the south side of the mill pond had always been strange. Old families in Tennessee told stories about that land, stories passed down from their grandparents who had settled the county in the years after the Revolution. They said the ground there did not hold footprints the way it should. They said animals avoided it. They said people who went into the scrub alone sometimes came back different, quiet and pale, and refused to talk about what they had seen. After Horace disappeared and the note appeared and the lunch pail came back from the river bottom, some of them started to wonder. A few whispered it was not a man at all that had left the note. They whispered it at night, in low voices, when their wives were asleep and their children could not hear. They whispered that something had taken Horace, something that lived in the water or under the dam or behind the floodgate where no light reached. They whispered that the note was a lure, that whatever had taken Horace wanted someone else to come down to the gate alone and check it. These men did not say this out loud in daylight. They did not say it in the mill yard or in town. But they said it to each other in the dark, and once it was said, it could not be unsaid. After that week, nobody in Tennessee took that catwalk alone before dawn. Not then. Not ever again. The foreman made it a rule, written in the logbook that every new worker had to read and sign. No man works the dam alone. 2 men minimum. No exceptions. The rule stayed in place for years, long after the foreman retired, long after most of the men who had known Horace were dead or gone. It stayed because the men who worked the Harpeth River mills understood that some rules are not made to be convenient. Some rules are made to keep you alive. One night in the 4th week, a boy from town, the son of one of the mill hands not yet 15, decided he was brave enough to walk down to the dam alone and see what all the fear was about. He took a lantern and went after midnight. He climbed the fence. He walked the catwalk. He stood at the spillway and looked at the floodgate, and he saw nothing unusual. He felt proud of himself. He felt like the men were cowards. He turned to go back, and that was when he heard it. A soft scraping sound, metal on stone, coming from directly behind the gate. He ran. He dropped the lantern and ran, and he did not stop until he was back over the fence and halfway to town. He told his father what he had heard, and his father took him by the shoulders and shook him hard, and told him never to go back there again. The boy never did. 20 years later, when he was a man with children of his own, he still would not walk past the mill at night. The lunch pail stayed in the foreman's office for 2 months, sitting on the shelf above the desk where everyone could see it. No one touched it. No one moved it. It sat there like a relic, like something that could not be thrown away but could not be used either. Then one morning in late winter, the foreman came to open the office and found the pail was gone. The shelf was empty. The window was locked. The door had been bolted from the outside all night. He asked every man at the mill if they had taken it. Every man said no. They searched the mill house, the yard, the wheel housing. They did not find it. 3 days later, a child walking to school along the river path saw something sitting on the stone lip of the dam. She did not go near it. She ran to the mill and told her father. Her father walked down with 2 other men, and they saw it there. The lunch pail, upright and clean, the wire handle folded down neat. This time there was no note inside. This time the pail was warm. They did not bring it back. They left it where it was, and they told the men to stay away from the spillway unless the work required it, and even then to go in pairs and never after the sun touched the tree line. The pail sat there for a week. Then it was gone again, and no one saw who took it or where it went. No one went looking for it, and no one asked questions, because by then the people around the Harpeth River in Tennessee had learned that some things are better left alone. Wade Turley left the mill 2 months after the note appeared. He told the foreman he was moving west to live with his brother in Arkansas, but everyone knew the real reason. He could not stand working near the dam anymore. He could not stand the smell of hot metal that came and went without warning, or the way the lantern still leaned toward the floodgate on calm nights, or the sound of scraping that came from behind the iron plates when the mill was quiet. He was not the only one who left. By the end of that year, 6 men had quit and moved away, and the foreman had trouble finding replacements because the stories had spread. The gate was never opened again. The mill kept running, but the floodgate stayed bolted shut, and after a few years the rust grew so thick the bolts could not be turned. The spillway boards were left to rot. The catwalk was repaired only when necessary, and even then the men worked fast and did not linger. The mill pond sat dark and still under its mist, and the water passed through the sluice the way it always had. But the place felt different now. It felt watched, and the people who worked there knew better than to turn their backs on the water, especially when the light was low and the air smelled like iron, and the only sound was the soft scrape of metal on stone that no one could explain. The mill ran for 12 more years after Horace disappeared, but it was never the same. Men worked the day shifts and went home before the sun touched the tree line, and no one argued about the lost hours or the money they could have made working nights. The foreman's rule stayed in the logbook, written clear in black ink on the first page where every new man had to read it and sign his name below. No man works the dam alone. 2 men minimum. No exceptions. New workers learned the rule on their first day, and the older hands made sure they understood it was not a suggestion. It was survival. By 1935, the mill had changed hands twice. The new owners tried to bring back the night shifts, tried to run the wheel around the clock the way mills in other parts of Tennessee were doing, but they could not find men willing to work the dam after dark. They raised the pay. They offered bonuses. It did not matter. Men in Tennessee still remembered what had happened to Horace Lyle, and they still remembered the lunch pail that came back from the river bottom warm, and they still remembered the note in his handwriting that told them to check the gate, and none of them wanted to be the next one to disappear. The mill closed for good in 1940. The wheel stopped turning. The stones went silent. The spillway boards rotted through, and the floodgate stayed bolted shut under layers of rust so thick you could not see the iron underneath anymore. The mill pond sat dark and flat under its mist, and the catwalk sagged in the middle where the wood had given way, and no one came to repair it because there was no reason to repair it and no one wanted to stand on those planks long enough to drive a nail. The property changed hands again in 1947. A man from Nashville bought it with the idea of turning it into a fishing camp, a place where people could come on weekends to sit by the water and forget about the war and the years that had followed. He built a small dock. He cleared some brush. He hung a sign by the road that said, "Harpeth Fishing Camp, open sunrise to sunset." He did not stay open long. Fishermen who came to the property said the place felt wrong. They said the water did not move the way water should move, that it sat too still even when the current was running. They said they heard sounds from the direction of the old floodgate. Soft scraping sounds, metal on stone, always just after the sun went down. Most of them packed up and left before dark. The ones who stayed said they did not sleep well, and they did not come back. The man from Nashville sold the property in 1949 and moved back to the city. He told people the fishing camp had not been profitable, but the people who lived along the Harpeth River knew the real reason. He had spent 2 nights alone in a cabin he built near the mill pond, and on the second night, he had heard something walking on the old catwalk. Slow, steady footsteps, boots on wet wood, just like the sound the older hands remembered from the night Horace disappeared. He left the next morning and never came back, not even to collect the tools he had left behind. By the 1950s, the story had become part of the fabric of life along that stretch of river. Mothers told their children not to go near the old mill property, not even in daylight, not even with friends. Teachers at the school 2 miles downriver made sure students knew to stay on the main road and never cut through the woods toward the mill pond. When new families moved into the area, the older families told them the story. Not all of it, not the parts that sounded too strange to believe, but enough to make sure they understood the rules. You do not go near the dam alone. You do not answer if you hear someone calling from the direction of the floodgate. You do not touch anything you find near the spillway, no matter how ordinary it looks. One autumn morning in 1958, a schoolteacher walking her class along the river path to study the changing leaves found something sitting on the stone lip of the old dam. It was a lunch pail, tin and dented, the wire handle folded down neat. She did not go near it. She gathered the children and walked them back to the school, and she told the principal what she had seen. The principal called a man who had worked at the mill in the 1930s, one of the few still living who remembered Horace. The man came and looked at the pail from a distance and said, "That's his. That's Horace's pail. I'd know it anywhere." They left it where it was. 3 days later, it was gone. The pail appeared again in 1963, and again in 1971, and again in 1984. Always in the same place. Always upright and clean. Always warm when someone was brave enough or foolish enough to touch it. And always gone within a week, taken by the river or by something else. No one knew which, and no one wanted to guess. Each time it appeared, the old families along the Harpeth told the new families the story again, and the new families learned to stay away from the dam, and the rules were passed down one more time to one more generation that had never known Horace Lyle, but feared the place where he had disappeared all the same. In 1995, a developer from Memphis proposed tearing down what was left of the old mill and building vacation cabins along the riverbank. The county held a meeting to discuss the proposal. More than 200 people came, most of them families who had lived along the Harpeth for 3 or 4 generations. They stood up one by one and said the same thing. Leave it alone. Do not build there. Do not bring people there who do not know the history and do not understand the rules. The developer argued that the property had been abandoned for 50 years and that the old stories were just that. Stories, nothing more. But the county voted against the proposal, and the developer left, and the old mill stayed abandoned. By the time the 21st century arrived, most of the original mill buildings had collapsed. The wheel housing was gone. The catwalk had fallen into the water. The spillway stones were covered in moss and ivy, and you could barely see the outline of the floodgate under the rust and the vines. But the stories had not collapsed. They had not rotted or rusted, or been covered over by time. They were still told, still passed down, still obeyed. Parents still told children not to go near the old dam. Fishermen still avoided that stretch of river after dark. Hunters still walked around the property rather than through it. And when someone new to the area asked why, the old families said, there was a man who disappeared there in 1928. They never found him. And things still happen there that should not happen. They did not say more than that, because they did not need to. In 2003, a historian from Vanderbilt came to the area to research the history of mills along the Harpeth River. She interviewed a dozen people who had family connections to the old mill, and every one of them told her some version of the same story. She asked to see records, documents, anything that might explain what had happened to Horace Lyle. They showed her the logbook from 1928, still kept in a box in the county archives, with Horace's handwriting marking water levels up until the night he disappeared. They showed her the foreman's rule, still written on the first page in black ink. They told her about the lunch pail, about the note, about the smell of hot metal and the sound of scraping behind the gate. She asked if anyone had ever tried to open the floodgate to see what was behind it. They looked at her like she had suggested something obscene. No, one of them said, and no one ever will. Some people still say Horace had enemies, that the farmer named Clyde Booth, or someone else with a grudge, had done something to him and hidden the body so well it was never found. That version makes sense if you need the world to stay the shape you think it is. Some people say it was an accident, that Horace slipped on the wet catwalk and fell into the mill pond and got caught under the wheel or wedged against the floodgate where the current held him down and the silt covered him over. That version makes sense too, if you do not think too hard about the lunch pail or the note or the way the dogs refused to move or the way the pail kept coming back, always warm, always in the same place. But there is a third version. The one that nobody in Tennessee says out loud, the one that gets whispered in the dark when children are asleep and outsiders are not listening. That version says something took Horace. Something that lives in the water or under the dam or behind the floodgate in the cold black space where no light reaches. Something that knows how to shape letters the way a man shapes them. Something that can make a lunch pail sink to the bottom of a river and then place it back on the stone lip, warm as if it had just been held. Something that scrapes metal on stone in the dark and leaves no marks. Something that still walks the catwalk on certain nights, boots on wet wood, steady as a clock, looking for the next man who will come down alone to check the gate. People in Tennessee still will not work that stretch of the Harpeth River after the sun goes down. They still will not answer if they hear someone calling from the direction of the old dam. They still teach their children the rules, the same rules their grandparents taught them, and they still obey those rules even though most of them have never seen the lunch pail or heard the scraping, or smelled the hot metal in cold air. They obey because the ones who came before them learned the hard way that some places remember what happened there, and some things do not let go, and some questions are better left unasked, because the answer is worse than the not knowing. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in Tennessee dares to say out loud? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.